one quiet decision. No public announcement. No royal decree. Just a silent instruction issued behind closed doors at Windsor. And within hours, every lock that Camilla once had access to was replaced. Palace staff are now breaking their silence. What really happened that night? And why would Prince William take such a drastic step against the Queen Consort herself? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began, according to those who were there, with a message that carried no emotion, and yet changed everything. A short directive passed through internal channels. Discreet. Urgent. Immediate compliance required. There were no explanations attached, no dramatic speeches about security or restructuring. Just a clear instruction: replace every lock connected to specific private quarters within Windsor. The order was executed with astonishing precision. Locksmiths arrived under routine pretenses. Corridors were cleared quietly. Within hours, metal turned, bolts shifted, and access that had existed for years vanished without warning. Senior aides were stunned. Some believed it was a security drill. Others assumed a temporary protocol. But as the night unfolded, confusion turned into realization. This was not routine. This was decisive. William had acted without public consultation, without ceremony, and without signaling his intentions beyond a tight inner circle. For a royal institution built on layers of approval and tradition, that kind of unilateral move carried weight. It was authority in its purest form. And then came the moment that made it personal. Camilla, accustomed to entering certain rooms without hesitation, reportedly found her keys no longer worked. A subtle humiliation. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just a quiet, unyielding denial of entry. In royal life, access is not convenience. It is trust. It is standing. It is power. When the locks changed, the message was impossible to ignore. The deeper symbolism sent a chill through Windsor. These were not just doors secured against intrusion. They were boundaries drawn. Lines marked. Spaces reclaimed. Some staff whispered that it felt like the beginning of something larger. A slow but unmistakable internal shift toward the future reign. A son stepping into position. A stepmother realizing that proximity does not guarantee permanence. The emotional undertone lingered heavily in the air. On one side stood William, fiercely protective of legacy, of memory, of a history that shaped him. On the other stood Camilla, holding a title earned through years of scrutiny and survival. Their dynamic had always been carefully managed in public, but behind the palace walls, that balance now felt fragile. Staff sensed it immediately. Conversations quieted. Movements became cautious. Even the most seasoned employees admitted that something fundamental had shifted overnight. By morning, the corridors felt colder. Not because of temperature, but because certainty had disappeared. A silent tension replaced the familiar rhythm of royal routine. People walked carefully. They watched more closely. And beneath the calm exterior of Windsor, a question echoed among those who served within it: what had happened to force such an extraordinary act? Because the real shock was not the mechanics of changing locks. It was the urgency behind it. The determination. The finality. William had not acted out of impulse. He had acted out of conviction. And as palace staff continue to speak in hushed tones, one truth becomes harder to dismiss. This was not a random decision made in the dark of night. It was a response to something deeper. Something that made him believe there was no other path forward. But the real shock wasn't that the locks were changed. It was why William felt he had no other choice. This wasn't a spontaneous act. According to insiders, the tension between William and Camilla didn't start last week or last year. It has been quietly building for years. Smiles in public, silence in private, a fragile truce masking unresolved wounds. And now, palace staff suggests that the lock changes were the final response to something that crossed an invisible line. To understand the weight of that decision, you have to go back to a legacy that never stopped casting a shadow. William's loyalty to his mother was never performative. It was personal, deep, unshakable. Diana was not just a memory, she was a moral compass. Every corridor of royal life still echoes with her absence. And for William, protecting that legacy has always been more than sentiment. It has been a responsibility, a quiet vow carried into adulthood. Camilla's presence within the palace, however, represented a different reality. Over the years, her influence grew steadily, not loudly, not aggressively, but undeniably. Access to conversations, access to planning rooms, access to decisions that shaped the monarchy's public image. She navigated survival with discipline, building her standing step by step. For some, it was resilience. For others, it was intrusion into sacred territory. Staff began noticing subtle disagreements long before the locks were replaced. Not shouting matches, not dramatic confrontations, but strategic differences over access to specific Windsor quarters. Certain rooms carried symbolic weight, archives tied to royal history, correspondence preserved with intention, spaces that were less about walls and more about meaning. When access to those rooms became a subject of tension, it stopped being logistical and became deeply emotional. Whispers traveled carefully among palace employees. They spoke of confidential areas, restricted archives, documents connected to the past that William guarded fiercely. Some believed he felt those spaces should remain untouched, protected as part of a personal legacy rather than political strategy. Camilla, operating within her role, may have viewed access differently, less about memory, more about continuity of power. That difference in perspective created friction that never fully healed. Beneath the surface, an emotional undercurrent flowed steadily. On one side, a son protecting what he believed defined his identity. On the other, a queen consort determined to maintain relevance within an evolving institution. Resentment did not explode overnight. It accumulated quietly. Every polite exchange layered over unspoken discomfort. Every ceremonial appearance masking private distance. Then came what insiders describe as a moment when patience ran out. Not a dramatic spectacle, but a realization. A boundary, once flexible, had been pushed too far. For William, it was not about rivalry. It was about preservation. About drawing a line before legacy blurred into compromise. The future king began to see a widening divide between what the monarchy was becoming and what he believed it needed to be. That divide extended beyond personal emotion. It reflected a broader shift between the future monarchy and the current hierarchy. William represents what comes next. Camilla symbolizes what was fought to stabilize. Their coexistence required balance. And balance over time became fragile. By the time the locksmiths were called, the decision was not born from impulse. It was the culmination of years of restraint, years of calculation, years of silent endurance. The locks were simply the visible outcome of an invisible conflict that had been unfolding behind closed doors far longer than the public realized. And what allegedly triggered the final decision may be more explosive than anyone imagined. Sources claim there was one specific moment, a private interaction inside Windsor that changed everything. A confrontation, a discovery, or perhaps a breach of trust. Details remain guarded, but staff now hint that something occurred within rooms Camilla had long accessed freely. And William's response was immediate, decisive, and irreversible. It did not happen in front of cameras. There were no witnesses from the outside world. Only a handful of insiders who suddenly found themselves standing too close to something they were never meant to see. According to quiet accounts circulating within palace walls, the tension that had been simmering for years crystallized in a single exchange. A door closed, voices lowered but sharpened. A realization that certain boundaries had been crossed. The heart of the issue, staff suggest, may have involved sensitive correspondence, documents tied not only to royal administration, but to legacy itself. Letters preserved from another era, archives connected to Diana's memory, materials that William reportedly viewed not as procedural records, but as sacred inheritance. When whispers began that those rooms had been accessed without his explicit knowledge, something shifted inside him. What others might have seen as routine review, he interpreted as intrusion. Accounts describe a heated exchange, though no one dares to repeat exact words. The energy, however, was unmistakable. William stepped in with a resolve that surprised even seasoned aides. This was not hesitation. This was not negotiation. It was controlled anger wrapped in royal composure. Years of silent endurance condensed into one defining moment. For Camilla, accustomed to navigating delicate politics, the resistance she encountered this time felt different. Firm. Final. Within hours, an emergency meeting was called with senior advisors. No broad consultation. No extended debate. Just a focused discussion on what would happen next. Officially, the move would be framed as a security protocol, a modernization, a precaution. But those in the room understood the truth. This was not about routine updates. It was about trust. And trust, once fractured, demands consequences. Behind closed doors, emotions ran high. Not loud, not theatrical, but intense. William reportedly made it clear that certain spaces were non-negotiable, certain histories untouchable. For him, this was about protecting more than physical documents. It was about guarding identity, safeguarding a legacy that shaped who he is and who he intends to become. The future king was drawing a boundary in real time. The decision moved quickly from conversation to action. Locksmiths were contacted discreetly. Orders were precise. Every lock connected to those sensitive quarters was to be replaced before sunrise. Efficiency replaced debate. By the time dawn broke over Windsor, the transformation was complete. Keys that once opened doors now met resistance. Access that had been assumed was quietly revoked. Silence followed. Departments were instructed to avoid discussion. Internal communication tightened. Staff understood the message without needing it spelled out. Something extraordinary had occurred, and speaking about it could cost more than a position. The palace returned to its composed exterior, but beneath that surface, tension pulsed steadily. What made this moment so explosive was not simply the argument or the documents involved. It was the finality of William's response. There was no gradual distancing, no symbolic warning. He chose action over diplomacy, protection over appeasement. And in doing so, he signaled that the future of the monarchy would not be shaped by compromise when legacy felt threatened. The locks were replaced, the keys invalidated, but the emotional fracture remained. And as staff quietly absorbed what they witnessed, one truth lingers heavier than the metal that sealed those doors. But removing keys from a queen consort isn't just logistical, it's symbolic warfare. In royal tradition, keys are more than metal. They represent trust, access, and influence. By changing every lock Camilla once opened, William didn't just secure rooms. He sent a message. Clear. Unmistakable. And according to palace insiders, the symbolism was deliberate. Within the monarchy, access has always functioned as a silent ranking system. Who holds the key determines who holds proximity. And proximity, in royal life, is power. To enter certain quarters without question is to stand within the inner circle of authority. To lose that privilege is to feel the subtle but undeniable shift of status. When William ordered those locks replaced, he was not merely adjusting security. He was redefining boundaries inside the very structure that sustains the crown. Staff immediately understood what the public could not yet see. This was not a routine update. It was a recalibration of hierarchy. Camilla's physical access to particular Windsor spaces diminished overnight. Doors that once opened without hesitation now required permission. The difference was quiet, almost invisible from the outside, yet profound within palace walls. In royal dynamics, nothing speaks louder than who can walk where. For Camilla, the shift carried emotional weight. Years of endurance had secured her position beside the king. Public scrutiny had tested her resilience. Gradually, she built influence within internal corridors, becoming a consistent presence in discussions that shaped royal narrative. And now, without spectacle or argument, that influence felt contained. Not stripped entirely, but strategically narrowed. It was a reminder that proximity to the throne does not guarantee control over its future. Among palace staff, the psychological impact was immediate. Longtime employees noticed changes in routine. Access lists were quietly updated. Invitations to private meetings subtly adjusted. Conversations once shared freely became more guarded. No announcement declared a new era, yet the atmosphere suggested one had already begun. William's move felt like preparation, a rehearsal for leadership, a signal that his reign would not be passive or inherited blindly. There was also a deeper layer of calculation beneath the emotion. By framing the decision as security protocol, William avoided public confrontation while achieving a strategic outcome. The narrative remained controlled. No accusations, no scandal, just a necessary modernization, executed with precision. But those closest to the situation sensed that this was more than policy. It was consolidation. Power within the monarchy rarely shifts through dramatic proclamations. It moves quietly, through access, alliances, and influence. By tightening control over key spaces, William strengthened his own position without uttering a single confrontational word. He asserted authority not by challenging Camilla publicly, but by limiting the scope of her reach privately. It was controlled, measured, strategic. As days passed, a growing awareness settled across Windsor. The transition of power had unofficially begun. Not through coronation or ceremony, but through action. The future king had stepped forward, drawing lines that would define the next chapter of royal leadership. Camilla's reduced presence in certain corridors symbolized more than a personal setback. It reflected a broader shift toward a monarchy shaped by William's priorities, and beneath the political maneuvering lay something deeply human. This was not only about hierarchy, it was about identity, legacy, and control. William was signaling that the institution he would one day lead would operate on his terms. The locks were only the first visible sign. Yet the most emotional reaction may not have come from Camilla, but from King Charles himself. Imagine being king and watching your son override the access of your wife. Insiders suggest Charles was informed only after the changes were made. No dramatic showdown, just quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened. And now, the monarch finds himself in the most delicate position of his reign, balancing loyalty to his Queen Consort and the authority of his heir. For Charles, the timing was the first shock, not the concept of tightened security, not the logic of protecting sensitive spaces, but the speed, the finality, the fact that the decision had already been executed before he could weigh its consequences. Those close to him suggest he received the update with controlled composure, yet beneath that calm exterior lay a swirl of emotion. A king accustomed to navigating decades of public scrutiny was now confronting something far more personal: division inside his own household. Within the marriage, the strain was impossible to ignore. Camilla had fought relentlessly to secure her standing. Years of criticism, resistance, and slow acceptance had shaped her into a figure of endurance. And now, an action taken by her stepson subtly redefined her position. Not publicly, not ceremonially, but unmistakably. Charles stood at the center of that shift, aware that whatever he said, or failed to say, would carry weight. William's assertion of autonomy added another layer of tension. This was not a son seeking approval. It was a future king exercising authority. By acting independently, William signaled that he was prepared to make difficult decisions, even when they intersected with his father's personal life. For Charles, that independence may have been both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it demonstrated strength. Unsettling because it bypassed him. Advisors reportedly urged caution. Escalation, they warned, would only deepen fractures. The monarchy thrives on unity, or at least the appearance of it. Public disagreement between king and heir could destabilize carefully maintained narratives. Charles understood this instinctively. He has spent a lifetime balancing image and emotion. So instead of confrontation, he chose restraint. But restraint does not erase tension. Palace divisions began forming quietly, not open camps, not declared alliances, just subtle shifts in loyalty and perspective. Some staff admired William's decisiveness, seeing it as preparation for the future. Others sympathized with Camilla, interpreting the move as unnecessarily harsh. Charles, caught in the middle, had to absorb those currents without allowing them to surface. The father and son dynamic now carried a new weight. For years, William supported his father publicly, reinforcing the crown's stability. Now he had acted in a way that tested that bond. It was not rebellion. It was assertion. And assertion, within a royal structure built on hierarchy, can feel like challenge. Beyond personal feelings, the monarchy itself felt the tremor. Stability depends on clarity of roles. When boundaries blur, uncertainty follows. Charles faced a choice: defend his wife openly and risk appearing divided from his heir, or remain silent and risk appearing detached. Silence, for now, became his shield. A strategic pause. A king calculating not just emotional consequences, but institutional ones. Yet silence can be louder than words. It leaves space for interpretation. It invites speculation, and within that space, narratives begin to grow. Charles may have hoped that time would smooth the edges of this conflict, that discretion would preserve dignity. But even as Windsor maintains its composed exterior, the emotional pressure inside those walls continues to build. And the most dangerous part of pressure is not the moment it is felt, it is the moment it escapes containment. But outside Windsor's walls, whispers have already begun leaking into the public sphere. For days, the palace held firm. No statements, no confirmations. But now, staff members are beginning to talk. Carefully, anonymously. And what they're describing paints a picture far more intense than a simple lock change. They speak of fear, uncertainty, and a monarchy quietly reshaping itself in real time. At first, it was just a whisper between departments. A quiet acknowledgement that yes, the locks had been replaced. Not one, not two. All of them. Anonymous confirmations began circulating beyond Windsor's guarded corridors. No one wanted their name attached. No one wanted to be seen as disloyal. Yet the consistency of the accounts made one thing undeniable. This had been coordinated, deliberate, and absolute. Staff described the overnight execution with striking clarity. The efficiency was surgical. Locksmiths were escorted through controlled entrances. Access lists were updated in synchronized fashion. Digital systems were adjusted to mirror physical changes. It was not chaos. It was control. The kind of operation that only happens when leadership is certain and prepared for fallout. But beneath that precision, emotion simmered. Longtime employees who had served through multiple reigns admitted that the atmosphere felt different. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just heavier. As though everyone understood they were witnessing a turning point, but were forbidden from acknowledging it aloud. Conversations grew shorter. Meetings felt tense. Even routine interactions carried a cautious undertone. Silence was not optional. Internal instructions were clear. No external commentary. No internal speculation. No leaks. Yet silence can be more revealing than speech. The very effort to contain discussion signaled that this was not minor housekeeping. It was sensitive. Potentially destabilizing. The more tightly the palace pressed down on information, the more pressure built beneath it. Speculation quickly expanded beyond the locks themselves. Some staff hinted at additional security reviews underway. Quiet assessments of who held access to what. Subtle shifts in privilege that extended beyond Camilla. It began to feel less like a single act, and more like a broader restructuring. A recalibration of influence. A methodical tightening of control in preparation for something larger. Internal communications reportedly used careful language. Words like realignment, protocol enhancement, future readiness. Phrases that sound administrative on the surface yet carry strategic undertones. Those reading between the lines sensed the message: the monarchy was adjusting itself from within. And adjustments of this scale do not happen without intention. Among royal circles, shock rippled quietly. Allies of Camilla struggled to interpret what this meant for her standing. Supporters of William viewed it as decisive leadership. Observers outside the immediate palace environment began connecting dots, sensing that the tension previously confined to private quarters had finally manifested in action. The most striking revelation from staff was not anger or outrage. It was uncertainty. A recognition that something foundational had shifted. The locks were tangible proof. But the deeper change was psychological. Employees began asking themselves what future decisions might look like if this was the new standard. Swift, quiet, uncompromising. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the growing awareness that this moment did not exist in isolation. It felt like part of a larger pattern unfolding behind the scenes. A future king consolidating influence before the crown officially passes. A palace preparing itself for transition without declaring one. If replacing locks could send this powerful a message, What other adjustments might already be underway? What other boundaries might soon be redrawn without announcement? The whispers now escaping Windsor suggest that this was not the climax of a private dispute. It was the opening move in something far more consequential. And if the locks were only the beginning, what comes next could redefine the monarchy forever. Behind every shift in royal power lies a future vision, and insiders suggest that Catherine's quiet presence during this moment was anything but accidental. While William moved decisively, the Princess of Wales reportedly stood firmly aligned, silent, composed, and fully aware of the long game. In moments of upheaval, it is often the quiet figures who reveal the most. Catherine did not issue statements. She did not step into the spotlight to defend or confront. Instead, her strength appeared in restraint. Those inside the palace describe her as steady during the days that followed the lock changes, offering calm where tension threatened to spill over. That composure was not passive. It was strategic. It signaled unity between the future king and future queen without inviting open conflict. Her understated support carried weight. In royal life, alignment is everything. A glance, a presence at a meeting, a subtle shift in seating arrangements can communicate volumes. Staff noticed that Catherine remained consistently by William's side during private discussions about internal restructuring. She did not interfere, but neither did she distance herself. It was a shared posture, one that reinforced the idea that this decision was not impulsive, but carefully considered within their partnership. There is also an emotional thread woven into her stance. Catherine has long demonstrated deep respect for Diana's legacy, honoring it not through confrontation, but through continuity. For William, protecting that memory is personal. For Catherine, it is shared responsibility. Insiders suggest that her understanding of that legacy strengthened her support during this internal clash. It was not about rivalry. It was about preservation of values they believed define the monarchy's future. As Camilla's influence appeared to narrow in certain areas, subtle changes in planning began to surface. Invitations to strategic discussions increasingly reflected William and Catherine's priorities. Staff observed shifts in tone during briefings, with a growing emphasis on modernization, streamlined authority, and long-term vision. None of it was announced publicly, yet internally it felt like positioning. The future monarchy was quietly organizing itself. The generational divide, once subtle, now felt more visible. Charles and Camilla represent endurance through controversy, a reign built on resilience. William and Catherine represent transition, a recalibration of identity. The lock changes became symbolic of that divide. Not a rebellion, but a recalculation. Not a rejection, but a redefinition. Long-term implications began to settle in the minds of those closest to the crown. If William was willing to act with such clarity now, what might his reign look like once authority is fully his? Catherine's calm alignment suggested that their vision is unified. That unity carries strength. It also carries inevitability. The palace is an institution shaped by momentum, and momentum now appears to be shifting forward. For Camilla, this evolution feels personal. For Charles, it feels delicate. For staff, it feels historic. The future is no longer abstract. It is organizing itself in quiet, deliberate steps. And at the center of that movement stands a couple who understand both the weight of legacy and the necessity of change. Yet beneath strategy and symbolism lies something more fragile. Because power can be recalibrated, access can be restricted, influence can be reshaped. But when trust fractures within a family and an institution built on loyalty, the consequences extend far beyond protocol. But perhaps the deepest consequence of all lies not in doors locked, but in trust permanently broken. This isn't about keys. It isn't about doors. It's about power, legacy, and a future king drawing a line. 1 minute ago, the world believed Windsor's walls were stable and unified. Now palace staff have revealed a fracture that could shape the monarchy for decades. And the locks that changed that night may have sealed far more than rooms. What unfolded behind those guarded corridors feels less like an isolated dispute and more like the symbolic beginning of William's leadership era. Not crowned yet, not formally in command, but already defining boundaries. Leadership does not always wait for ceremony. Sometimes it announces itself through action. By choosing decisiveness over diplomacy, William signaled that his reign, when it arrives, will not be hesitant. It will be protective, strategic, unapologetically clear. For Camilla, the future now feels uncertain in ways it has not before. She has survived public storms, media scrutiny, and decades of controversy. Yet this moment carries a different kind of vulnerability. It is internal, quiet, structural. Her standing may remain intact in title, but influence is measured in proximity and participation. If access narrows, so does authority. And within royal life, diminished access speaks louder than any public statement ever could. Charles, meanwhile, continues navigating fragile peace. His silence has become its own statement. A king balancing stability with personal loyalty. A husband absorbing the tension between past battles and future succession. He understands that open conflict would fracture more than reputation. It would test the very foundation of the crown. So he holds steady, even as the emotional weight presses inward. Staff sense what cannot be openly declared. An irreversible transition has begun. The locks were not the end of something, they were the marker of a turning point. A quiet acknowledgement that the future monarchy is stepping forward, shaping itself before inheritance becomes official. Those who serve within Windsor feel it in subtle changes. Tone, authority, direction. The atmosphere is no longer simply about maintaining tradition. It is about preparing for evolution. At the heart of it all lies loyalty and protection. William's actions were not born from impulse alone, but from conviction. A determination to guard legacy, to define his role before it is handed to him. That emotional intensity resonates beyond strategy. It speaks to identity, to memory, to a son who refuses to let history blur into compromise. Strangely, the monarchy may be entering a quieter but stronger phase. Tension does not always signal weakness. Sometimes it reveals clarity. The institution has weathered far greater storms, yet this internal shift feels uniquely intimate. It is not the clash of public opinion. It is the recalibration of private power. Outside Windsor, intrigue continues to grow. The public senses that something significant has occurred, even if details remain carefully managed. Questions linger. Interpretations multiply. And with every whispered revelation, anticipation builds for what might follow. Because power rarely shifts only once. It moves in waves. The locks changed in a single night, but the consequences will unfold over years. Future confrontations may not come with raised voices or dramatic declarations. They may arrive quietly, strategically, reshaping influence step by measured step. What began as a silent order could echo into the next reign. Because when the locks change inside a palace, the entire kingdom eventually feels it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.